What qualities make a great MSL?
If you can get an in, then you want to.
Welcome to ChatGPD, our podcast on careers in biomedical sciences. And we are welcoming today's first guest, Dr. Michelle Dubinsky. And Dr. Michelle Dubinsky is a medical science liaison at Boehringer Ingelheim. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming, especially with all the snow outside. Michelle, I was wondering if you can start by just describing your job in lay terms for a non-scientific audience.
Yes, of course. So as a medical science liaison, we are really in the medical department of the pharmaceutical industry, and we speak to clinicians, specialists, scientists about clinical data and help them understand the data that is around a specific molecule.
And that molecule is usually associated with the drug.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, I want to just switch gears first and talk about your history in IMS, your history in graduate school. When was it that you decided academia and medicine were not for you and you wanted to transition into another career?
Yes, so I did my PhD in IMS. I did it finishing 2 years ago, and then I started my role. And really for me, the pivoting point was with COVID. So I originally thought I wanted to be, in academia, I wanted to be a teaching professor. I really loved educating. I would TA, I would do all of these things relating to that guest lecture. And then I realized with COVID that a lot of things went online. It wasn't that same interaction as I was hoping for originally. So I started looking into what other roles can I educate, can I speak to very intelligent, interesting people, and I found the MSL role. So medical science liaison, or there's also scientific liaisons, and I started looking into those roles, and I started doing a ton of informational interviews, really learning what the role entailed, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I realized it sounded fantastic. It was exactly what I wanted to do. And so then the next question was, how the heck do I get into it? And again, those informational interviews came in very handy to learn about getting into industry, breaking into different sectors. So it was all fantastic and on the up from there.
So I'm curious to know whether or not your degree in IMS, the actual science that you were researching, did you use that to leverage into your job? How did that help you, or did it detract? Or were there other extracurriculars that you did in IMS that actually were perhaps equally as important as the PhD to kind of leverage into that role? Can you describe some of the qualifications?
Of course. So in the MSL role, typically they do want a D degree, so a terminal degree, so an MD, a PharmD, or a PhD. So they know that you have that knowledge. That being said, it is not only for those. I have a colleague who is fantastic, and he did his MBiotech. And he has been at the company and is now my MSL colleague. He was kind of my trainer, if that makes sense, or my buddy at the company. So typically they do want that terminal degree, but it's not limited to just that. So with that, at least for my role in cardiorenal metabolism, I found that my PhD in cardiovascular epigenetics linked directly to it. So that was kind of one of my selling points. I've worked in this field already. I know some of the key opinion leaders or KOLs or external experts. Depending on what company you're at, they have a different term for it. So that, I think, definitely helped. In addition to that, I was involved in a lot of extracurriculars with the IMS. One of them I will always relate back to is mentorship. And so I ran the peer-to-peer mentorship program in the IMS. That led me to running the mentorship program in the Life Science Career Development Syndicate, or LSCDS, and that's where I met tons of industry professionals who were mentors in the program, and so they kind of helped to shape my understanding of the industry and helped lead me into a role as well. So really that connection.
Building your network, and that's a great way to build your network, especially if you are thinking of going into industry and you don't really. When we're doing our degrees in biomedical sciences, we really are connected to clinicians and scientists. So it's industry collaborations. You really have to go outside of the network that you are automatically in for grad school and reach out to LSCDS and other opportunities to meet people.
Definitely. And I would say, in addition to that, you mentioned the clinicians and scientists, and that's what I do in my role. I now have these relationships with clinicians and scientists, bringing them the data and gathering insights, which you'll hear is really taking what they say and bringing it back to the company, because we want to know how to best shape our clinical trials, how to best shape our molecule, where it fits in to the landscape, the clinical landscape. So having those connections through the PhD, as well as building the industry connections, I think is all extremely important. And that's one of the parts of the role. They say, scientific acumen as an MSL, business acumen, and relationship building are kind of the three main things, in addition to communication, which we develop through the PhD, and of course you can develop elsewhere.
So that's a great segue into my next question. I want to get a little more granular about the role.
Yeah.
Just tell me about your typical day, for starters.
Yeah, so I will always say that no day is typical, because so you'll hear that a lot, but really it typically will start in the morning with grand rounds or rounds that clinicians run. And so it's really nice now because it's virtual, so I can sit in my pajamas at 7 a.m. as opposed to going to the hospital and being there. However, the in-person aspect, you meet more people. Right. So it really does start with that, and then typically I will have a little bit of time in the morning to prep or plan my interactions, so my meetings with external experts or KOLs or whatever you want to call them. Usually I will have a lunch meeting. Physicians will take lunch or a break at lunch to talk about the data, etc. And then I will sometimes have another afternoon meeting. Usually afternoon meetings can be internal, so we will have team meetings or things like that. In addition to that, I need to do the administrative work of, once I've met with a physician, what did we talk about? Or is there anything I need to follow up on? So if we talked about a specific paper and they said, send me that paper, so you do the follow-up of that. You also document what you spoke about, document if there were any insights, so if there's anything that would be beneficial for the company to know, you put that in. And then in the evening, typically there are different programs, so there will be dinner programs, either accredited continuing medical education, or we will run what at Boehringer is called scientific exchange meetings. So these are discussions amongst peers about different data, clinical trials, the landscape, etc. So starting early, ending late, that's not a typical day necessarily, but that does happen. Other things that are common in the role are going to conferences, so attending scientific lectures there, meeting people at the conference, so doing lunches, dinners, etc., because that's when people have some free time when they're not in the sessions. And so really kind of every day is different, which is awesome, and you're meeting very interesting people. You develop these relationships and you have these nice conversations talking about science constantly, and also you get to know these people, right?
It sounds like a side job.
It's really exciting, yeah.
So I'm curious, MDs are typically very, very busy people. So how amenable are they to talking to you? I mean, I would be like, oh, I don't want to bother you. Are they welcoming to speak to MSLs? Is this something that they see beneficial for their job and how they perform their role? Or how do you find building those and forging those relationships with medical doctors?
Everyone is different. Everyone has their own personality. So really understanding what that physician is interested in. So if they are data-driven, great, bring them data. If they are patient-driven, you want to talk about the patients and understand their interests. And so I find once you build that relationship, it's very hard getting in. And so we always say, the administrators, et cetera, are the gatekeepers. If you can get an in, then you want to provide your value. You want to understand. So my first question is always, can you tell me a bit about your practice? Can you tell me about your patients? Because I want to understand what they see and what they care about. And you can learn a lot from, if they talk about their patients in a certain way, you can say, okay, they're really interested in that aspect. I'm going to bring that to them. So you really want to understand the person, and then go from there. Understand their needs, their wants, understand if there are any data gaps or knowledge gaps, and then you want to provide resources in any way you can.
Sounds like you have to be a bit of a behavioral expert as well to do this.
To a certain extent. You also get used, you kind of learn while doing as well. And so at Boehringer, it was really great because I mentioned my buddy earlier, and I was able to go kind of in the field with him and learn how he did it. And then we would have discussions, and my manager as well being there. Yeah, so he's really kind of my mentor, and still to this day we're very close. I now am a buddy for someone else, but having kind of him always there, like we can, discuss ideas, come up with thoughts. And my manager as well is fantastic whenever she's in the field with me as well. She will give suggestions. I was in the field with her last week, and we had a really great discussion because we were meeting with a key opinion leader or external expert or whatever, and we were back and forth in terms of the questions, and it was a really great discussion.
No, that's amazing.
So it wasn't like she was judging me because she's my manager. It was really like we were having a good discussion, asking questions. So really the environment there is nice. So kind of going back to your original question, I find it's hard to get in. Once you're in and the physicians find you provide value, then it's easy to go back.
So you kind of light up when you're talking about establishing those relationships. If you could say, what's your favorite aspect of the job? Would it be that? Or what would you say? What do you like most about what you do?
I love the interconnection between kind of science and patient care. In my PhD, I was at the bench. It was very molecular, which was great, but I was really missing that impact on patients. And so working for a pharmaceutical company with selling the medications that will help patients, that's the end goal. I always like to say, my wet bench work, maybe in 20 years we will get a molecule out of this, but will I be around to see it? Who knows? And maybe it will be one of the thousands of molecules that doesn't make it to clinical trials, whereas these medications are helping patients. And really, so we have that at the heart of it. The impact is there.
Yeah, you're helping to promote that
within the medical community.
Yeah, and then understanding
as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So always with a like in a job, there's a dislike. There's got to be balance. What would you say is the worst part of your job?
Honestly, I would say there's a lot of administrative work. So I mentioned after the interaction, which was great, you need to go back and document it all. You need to make your notes. You need to see if there's any insights that would be relevant. You need to fill out any questionnaires that we have internally to answer specific questions. So we know about these ahead of time, so you'll go in with those questions kind of at the back of your mind if they come up. So there's that administrative part. So there's always paperwork involved in any role. And I would say learning about the role, when I was speaking to industry professionals, they told me this. And I was like, okay, it's manageable. It's paperwork. You're going to have that in any role you do.
I think that will be the answer for pretty much everyone I interview.
Yeah.
I know it's a very rare person that likes administrative work.
Yeah.
And it's just a fact of everyday.
Exactly. So you do it, and that's fine.
You just get through. Now, what would the role of AI be in that going forward? Can you record these interviews? Is there any kind of disclosure that you have to sign? Would you use AI or algorithms that would help you record this and then summarize to kind of decrease that administrative burden? Or does Boehringer go? Is it going in that direction?
Yes, so Boehringer is definitely going in the AI direction in terms of recording the interactions that we have with physicians. Probably not. And I think because a lot of what is spoken about is, we say off-label. And so as a medical science liaison, you can speak about off-label content if it's in clinical trials and has not been indicated or approved by Health Canada yet. We talk about those things. So having that recorded is probably, I'm sure there's some legality or compliance with that. However, we are kind of in our internal systems documenting our insights, for example. We have started using AI to summarize. If we have a long paragraph of an insight, it can summarize it and kind of pull out the keywords. So that is helpful, and especially when you're looking at multiple insights, which I don't do yet, but my manager, for example, she will look at the entire team's insights and say, okay, we're noticing these keywords as trends. So I think we are moving in that direction.
Fabulous.
But again, I don't think that the one-on-one or the one-to-many interactions being recorded will happen anytime soon.
Okay. But it is nice to think of a day where, you're going to be able to spend more time forging relationships and growing those relationships rather than paperwork, because that's really what the machine cannot do, is go and introduce themselves and really establish that trust. This is a podcast mostly for graduate students. So I would like you to describe what qualities you think make a great MSL. So if a grad student is listening to this podcast, they can kind of either picture themselves in this role or not. What do you think, what kind of people thrive in this role?
Yes, so I think the way I would start it is by saying kind of what doesn't work so well in the role. And that's so, when you think of a PhD scientist, you think of them being at the bench, or kind of my envision. You think of them at the bench, you think of them very quiet, keeping to themselves, kind of head down working. Whereas here, like the personality type, you need to be open to forging relationships and putting yourself out there.
So extroverted. Yeah.
I would say that, however, I don't believe I'm extrovert. I would say I'm an extroverted introvert.
Okay.
Because I still like to go home and read a book and take my time to myself. But that kind of extroverted personality, you need to be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that will narrow down those that are interested in the role and those that aren't. And so first, I like to say, and when I do panels and career panels and things, I always say, know yourself. Be honest with yourself. Would you enjoy going out and talking to people? Would you enjoy having to speak to 3 or 4 different people in a day that you've never met? Some people will say, heck no. Yeah. And that's okay. So I think really that ability to know yourself and then to go out and be open to building relationships and, to walk in a room where you don't know anyone and make friends. Yeah. And that's something that, again, is really helpful in the role. In addition to that, it's understanding kind of the emotional quotient. And so if a physician says, you got 10 minutes, you take 10 minutes. Yeah. Right? And then you can say, I'm cognizant of the time. Are you okay for longer? And you can tell when they're engaged, when they're excited, when they're leaning in, that's great. But you really want to be respectful of their time, and you don't just want a data dump. So yes, you want to go in there and speak about the data, but if the conversation's not going in that direction, don't push it. You can always plan another meeting. So I was at an interaction last week and we talked, it was the first time I was meeting this physician, and we talked about her patient practice, we talked about her clinical practice and all the things involved, and then it was kind of time to go, like she started looking at her phone, and so I was like, okay, great. It would be great to set up another meeting where we can talk data. Would you be interested? And she's like, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Realizing that it's probably overwhelming if you just kind of like throw so much at them in an hour. Just do it in little bite-sized pieces.
And you get that follow-up, and that's something that's really important as well, is kind of planning the call, but then planning the follow-up steps and what's next. And so if I say, would you like to speak about the data next time? And she said, yes, great, I have a second meeting. We'll figure out a time and a date, but I have that already done, because then in my follow-up, great meeting you, when would you like to set up another time to meet and discuss the data?
Yeah.
So you already got that in, right? And so kind of making sure you can see the cues, as you're saying, read the room.
Read the room.
Is very important.
So being, emotionally aware, emotionally intuitive, so that, you recognize, you see that look in their eyes and you can intuit what they are needing at that moment. That sounds really important.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, that's a skill that you may or may not develop in grad school. If you could go back and what would you have done differently in your degree? Is there something you wish you had done or learned to help you in the role currently? Like an experience that you wanted to have that you didn't, or, some kind of technical knowledge that you didn't have? What would you have wanted to do differently with your own trajectory?
So I think I would have liked to have started a little bit earlier in my career exploration. Okay. And I say that because COVID was really when I started to look into what these roles were. But the earlier you start, the longer you have those lasting relationships and the more understanding you can have for different roles. So really kind of the earlier to start. The other thing is, the GPD courses, I think, are a fantastic way of doing that. Yeah, totally.
Courses, and then for the listeners that don't know these courses.
The graduate professional development courses that are offered at the IMS and many other departments, biochemistry, immunology, mold-gen, physiology, to name just a few. There really is an emphasis on graduate professional development at the University of Toronto now. And I would say nationally as well, many institutions are seeing that this is critical for their graduate students to start thinking early on about what they want to do, how they want to leverage this degree. Now, you don't go in to do a PhD or an MSc because you want to be a scientist. That's not necessarily the case. And a lot of grad students will say, well, I don't want to go and do my PhD because I don't want to be an academic. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, first of all, PhD is a phenomenal degree to have behind your name. It's a great period where you can hone so much more analytical, critical thinking, problem solving, communication. Yeah. There's so many transferable skills that are developed in the course of a graduate degree. And that's what you're gaining. You're not just gaining technical knowledge that you will leverage into an academic role. So, you know, you have spoken to that already. What are some of those transferable skills that you developed in either at the bench, in the lab setting, or in your extracurriculars? You talked about your peer-to-peer that really elevated you in an interview and made you stand out, because students are always curious about, how do I stand out in the interview? You know, you've got 50 people that are very similar to you. What is going to set you apart?
Yeah, so definitely the communication. And I think interviewing, you know, there is a skill in interviewing as well, and understanding kind of what questions are coming up, what the interviewer wants to know from asking a question. So the communication piece, and in an interview setting, really those stories. You want to be able to build stories that are relatable to others. And so kind of that, again, that EQ, that kind of connection is so important in any role, because when someone is hiring, yes, they're hiring for the technical skills per se, but they're also hiring for, will you fit in with the team? Right. Will I want to work with you?
Absolutely.
And so that kind of aspect of understanding what's underlying there, which helps with, again, in the PhD, you do get a lot of communication. It's different communication. I would recommend to graduate students, if they can, to TA. Because when you're speaking to younger students, you get a very different concept of what they understand. You can't just throw out all the technical terms, per se. And in an interview, the same thing. The first interview for any company is an HR screen. They are not going to understand your digital droplet PCR, for example. Right. You need to be able to explain how that helped you to understand your pathway or your disease state or whatever it is. Right. So really kind of knowing when to use jargon and when not to. And a lot of times early on in the interview process, you do not want to use the jargon.
Absolutely.
And so the GPD course, doing the 3-minute thesis, or even doing the 3-minute thesis, I know IMS just had one the other night, but really understanding, kind of speaking to the person you're interacting with and being at their level is always extremely helpful. And so again, you learn that as part of the grad program, you learn that in other aspects of graduate school, but even just communicating with your peers, how do you do that? Communicating with physicians, your supervisor, these are all different ways of communicating, and you tailor to your audience. So huge on the communication piece.
It seems like such a big part of this role. And I think one thing I've noticed in interviewing people myself is there's a tendency to ramble on in the interview. And that's why I just like saying, stay focused on your message. And that's true in any form of communication. Know your person you're communicating with. What do they need to know? And stick to the message. Because when you ramble, the message gets lost. So especially in an interview, there's that STAR method that I keep telling the students, I'm not making this up. No. This is actually a thing. You do your situation, your task, your action, your result. Stay with the script. It's great to have that narrative, but you got to stay with the script, because when you start rambling on, it does not impress people.
Yeah, totally. And now I'm thinking, was I rambling at all today?
Yeah. But I think you've been pretty much on task here.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You did a very good job.
Yes, I also think when you're kind of going back a little bit to the resume, writing also those CAR statements. So STAR for interview, the CAR statements, but the context, action, result. Because a lot of times in industry, they don't want to know exactly what you did. They want to know the result, the impact of it.
And your thinking process. Why did you do it?
Yeah.
And how did that help?
How did that help? Get the high level view. Everyone gets so stuck on Python, and these are important skills to have. I don't want to diminish them, but it really is about the kind of human being you are, and you nailed it. Whether or not they can see you as part of their organization, as a colleague, when they bump into you in the hallway, Do they want to stop and ask you how your weekend was? That's what builds a company. It's the people, and the environment that they're creating. So it's whether or not that person can fit. So I think, students should really think about that, portraying themselves in the interviews. Know what the fit is in the company. Know what their missions and values are.
Yeah.
Know how they fit into that, what they can bring to that. And I think that's a really important notion that's lost on a lot of students.
Definitely, and I think those who do that well, it's so important. I was actually speaking to a mentee of mine, so I am now a mentor. Now that I've moved into industry, I'm a mentor for a bunch of different programs. One of them is the LSCDS mentorship program. And my mentee was speaking about an interview, and I was like, oh, it's at this company, know their mission and vision, because they are very focused on that, and it's really embedded into everything they do. A lot of companies.
What's the mission and vision of where you're going on?
So we have kind of two different taglines, but one is transforming lives for generations. This is because it's a private company. So it's a family-owned private company that's been around for many years. And so because of that, we are thinking more long-term, not kind of the short-term goals, but really long-term. So that our new tagline is life forward.
Oh.
But transforming lives for generations is kind of the one that we really think about. And then this life forward. It's like, how can we, help you help your family, kind of holistic patient care, which is really nice. So thinking about the patient, thinking about how we can help the physicians. Yeah, so I really do love being at Boehringer.
That's awesome. What do you see as where is the industry going? What is the kind of immediate outlook? What is a 5-year outlook? How do you see it changing, either with AI or politics, or if you could just comment on where the industry as a whole is kind of moving?
I wish I could answer that.
But I know exactly not true.
But definitely, I think things that are important are AI. Like the industry really needs to use AI.
Yeah.
And so we actually had a training session a little bit ago, and it was just someone who has started on these different kind of AI, different things. So Copilot versus ChatGPT versus whatever else that she gave, a couple of them, and really understanding how to use them, because they're not going to, everyone's saying, oh, well, AI will replace us. I don't think it will replace us. I think it will, people that know how to use AI will be replacing us, because again, that emotional aspect, AI is not going to get that for a while at least. I mean, maybe faster than we think, but really leveraging AI to, instead of doing tasks manually, for them to, dive into the data or whatever it is, dive into the information so that you can get an output much faster.
Right.
So I think AI definitely. I also think that the industry is moving towards kind of more personalized medicine. We see that with, different molecules, biologics, CAR T cells, those things. It really is that personalized medicine phase. Again, depending on the company, chronic diseases have been a thing that are well known. The industry seems to be moving more into that space as well. And kind of the long term, so taking a medication long term as opposed to just, a medication for the cold that you have acutely.
Exactly. So actually, that is an interesting point as well for our grad students that are listening. If they are in a research area that is directly related to chronic disease, diabetes, cancer, cardiac, that sounds like they can leverage that into a role. What about students that aren't? How do they properly position themselves so that they can show that they are qualified for the MSL? Because I would imagine that technical knowledge that you gained through the 6 years of your PhD, more? Right? Seven. Okay. That sounds about right. That must be a very strong foundation for you to go into an interview, especially if they're looking for an MSL in like some kind of a cardiac application. That would give you a lot of confidence. If you don't have that, can you get that? Is that something that is replaceable, or is it something they can get, research and learn as much as they can about this disease state before an interview?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and a lot of students ask that. And typically when I was, getting information, doing informational interviews, I was always asked this question. Because I was like, am I pigeonholing myself? And really, the answer that I heard then, and I truly believe now, is if you can leverage it because you have that, great. If you don't, then you have a graduate degree, you know how to learn, you know how to research. That's one thing that we definitely all know how to do. So researching the disease state, researching the molecule, all those things can definitely be done. Also for me, and at most companies, you'll have an onboarding process. So like I did not need to be a disease state expert going in on day one. You are given all of the materials. Most companies will do, we call them readiness assessments. And so making sure you know the disease state and the landscape ahead of time so that you are field ready. So again, a lot of companies will have different terms for this, but really to understand that.
So you go through a boot camp.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
a cardiac boot camp or a cancer boot camp, and they get you up to speed on all of the clinical trials and the landscape of the drugs. And so it's more how you think, not what you know.
Yes, definitely. I don't think you need to go in. I mean, even me with my cardiology or my, cardiovascular epigenetic background, I did not understand all of the aspects of cardiology. So that was something I was kind of learning as I go, the mechanism of action of different molecules, what molecules are in the space. You don't necessarily know about them if you can't find them on the internet per se. And a lot of times before, indications or before drugs or medicines are approved, there's publications on them, but they don't give you all that information per se.
Right.
So really knowing how to learn, I think is definitely a great aspect. And also again, having connections at a company or someone that knows you that can put in a good word for you, or someone you've spoken to learn about the company culture. All of these things are part of it. Again, with the degree, you know how to learn. Yes. You know how to research. That is the checkbox you will have no matter what.
I'm always fascinated to hear about what people what they can envision for themselves in their career goals. Where is it that Michelle Dubinsky wants to go next? What is her 5-year plan? Where are you going? What do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be an MSL forever? Or do you want to grow within the company? Where do you see yourself going?
Yeah, so I think definitely for me, the MSL role is ever changing in the sense that when I started in my role, it was a little bit later in the life cycle of a molecule, and now we're starting something newer. So there's excitement and pre-launch and all of these things. So there's definitely still things for me to learn in the MSL role. I think there will always be things to learn in the MSL role. I do see myself moving into more of a head office medical advisor type role when, I don't know, but really thinking about kind of that. So the head office roles have a little bit more strategy involved. So a lot of times the MSL being in the field gains those insights from external experts. And then the strategic part is what do we want to know from the external experts? So having that kind of interaction at first and then moving into higher level strategic thinking as opposed to just thinking about your territory. You're thinking on a more national level. Yeah. Hopefully I will get there one day, but right now I'm just really excited that I'm going through a different part of the life cycle of different molecules, so there's always learning involved, which is great. And again, there's always kind of the ebbs and flows in the industry, but constant learning, which is something I love and something I'm happy to be involved in every day.
So when you talk about strategic thinking and more working on a national level, is that in what new molecules, what new diseases, or is that within the cardiac sphere ecosystem that you have more of a national influence in what happens with the drugs that are being developed at BI? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it really depends. For me, thinking kind of in my thought process would be in that cardiovascular or the cardiometabolic space, just because I know that space is a little bit more comfortable. However, you could go to a different disease state, a different therapeutic area, and it would still be that strategic thinking, that higher level thinking kind of overall. So there are different companies with different disease states, as well as within Boehringer, there are different disease states or therapeutic areas, we call them. So things like that, really depending. I mean, there are opportunities, which is great. And so understanding what is there and what I would like to do next. I think, again, going back to that first thing of understanding myself and understanding my goals. So
aligning your values.
Exactly. Yeah, what you are doing for sure. It is so important. It is so important. And this might be a personal question, are you happy? Are you happy in your job? And if you could have done things differently, if you could have, waved a magic wand and gotten in med school when you were, finishing your MSc, would you have wanted to, or do you like where you are now?
I really like where I am now. I mean, early on, I remember going into undergrad, my grandmother was always like, you're going to be a doctor.
Of course. And I was like, okay, great.
Common story.
Right? And then
For me, I went to McMaster for my undergrad, and after first year at Mac, you decide in second year what you're going to kind of specialize in. So going in, I went to a bunch of different kind of informational sessions, and I thought biochemistry was really cool. At Mac, in biochem, you either love it or you hate it because it's a lot of work. I always say I did biochemistry with a molecular biology specialization because I apparently was like, go big or go home. I didn't just want to do biochemistry. I needed that specialization. The specialization doesn't exist anymore. I joke that it was too difficult because we had no elective courses. They have changed to other kind of terms. I think it's in a specialization in medical science or something. Point is, in second year, you do a lot of lab time, more than any other course, and you love it or you hate it. And I really loved it, and so I stuck with that. And then my master's at Western was in biochemistry. My PhD I did in IMS, but my focus really was molecular biology in my PhD, and so I really thought I was going in that direction. After my master's, I took some time because I didn't take any time between undergrad and my master's. So I took some time and I realized I missed research. So I really thought I was going to go into research, but then I realized there's a lot that doesn't work.
there's a lot of head banging that
Well,
goes
and
on.
there's one thing about doing research,
Yeah.
and another thing, loving research.
Yes, exactly.
You see the utility, and you are reading about research now,
Yeah.
but you don't have to do the 6,000 pipetting steps
Exactly,
to 7,000
right?
Western blots to get the answers. So it's distillation of
Yeah.
all the knowledge that you're still a researcher.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, as I was saying, like all grad students, we know how to research, we know how to learn. So being a researcher and doing the research yourself, even as a PI, they're not doing the research anymore. They are, writing the grants, doing the high level strategy of the research, but they're not the ones doing the pipetting, having the sore thumbs and arms and whatnot. So really thinking about how you can still be involved in that in a different way. And for me, that impact piece of industry being directly involved in, if this patient gets this medication or not. If, you believe that for this particular patient, and physicians will ask, should this patient be on this medication? And as an MSL, I am, allowed to say no. This is not right for the patient. And having that opportunity as well, I find builds trust.
Yeah.
Because you're not just pushing your product. You're saying, look, this is not the right medication for this patient.
That also forces you to be very invested in what you do, because if physicians are asking me that question, I'm going to make sure I know everything inside out, because for me to offer that opinion, that's a big responsibility.
Definitely. And I think kind of getting there over time, probably wouldn't have said that, when I was first starting in the role, but I do a lot of times bring the question back to the physician. Well, what are your thoughts on this? Because really, I want to understand them better. What are your thoughts? What is your take on this data, right? What does this mean to you? How can you implement this in your patient practice, right? Because I'm not the one that's seeing patients, which is another thing I realized early on when I fell in love with research. I was like, I did not like blood. So it's funny because what was my PhD in?
Cardiovascular.
And blood. So I always joke about that. I'm like, I really did not like blood, but when you're looking at it from a totally different perspective.
Yeah. You have to be paid and to.
Exactly, right? To love it. So really kind of, again, understanding yourself and the twists and turns. And so I feel like I've been rambling, but going back to your question, am I happy? Yes. And I think really the skills that I developed in graduate school at the time.
You don't realize you're developing them?
Yeah.
And at the time, I was just like, it's done. Like, I'm done. I'm ready to move on.
Yeah.
But now looking back, I think it was great opportunities. And really for me with the IMS, I started with one thing and then it kind of snowballed, and I was involved in the CERT program, so the undergraduate research program, and I was involved not directly in IMSA, but
Kind of because I was part of the mentorship program.
Student association.
exactly, yes. And then because of that, having opportunities to TA the professional development course, so
All of these things
Get yourself out of your comfort zone.
helped.
Yeah, because when you get your name out there, especially in your graduate unit, then opportunities present themselves.
Yeah,
You know, you gotta just get involved. So that brings me to my next question. For all those students that are, struggling at the bench, and we all do at one point or another during our graduate degree, and losing faith and, I'll never be a researcher, I don't know what I want to do with my life. Hopefully they're listening to this podcast and their interest is piqued about MSL. What is your just global advice to graduate students when they're in that phase of nothing's working, their life prospects looks grim? What is a tidbit of advice that you think is most important to kind of anchor?
I think it's important to step away from the bench at that point. So if it's a vacation that you've never taken because you're all consumed with the work, but step away and really understand where you see yourself and what your values are. Because then going back into the research with a fresh set of eyes is always helpful. I think having a support system is necessary in graduate school, and whether that's your family, your friends, your colleagues, kind of having that support is so key. But again, kind of that step away, sometimes seeing it with fresh eyes, because you're so involved in it and you can't really see the forest for the trees at that point. But take a step back, look at the forest, see overall, if that one particular assay isn't working, okay, how can you do it differently? How can you approach it differently? Yeah. Kind of that out of the box thinking. Right. My dad would always say that. He'd be like, do you need to be in the box for this? Yeah. And he wouldn't necessarily come up with the solutions, but he'd be like, think outside of the box. He would give me some random wild and crazy idea. And usually they wouldn't work, but it was just the craziness of it gets you thinking differently.
Right. The shift in perspective. That's the whole concept of ideation. It's throw the crazy ideas out there, because there is a grain of reality and truth in a lot of these crazy ideas that you can apply. And I think it is so important in those moments of stress. Your self-worth is not linked to the success of your experiment.
Yeah.
Remove yourself out and realize that you are so much more a composite of other things than, the fabric of the success of your experiment.
Yeah.
You would forget that.
Definitely. And also finding other things. I mean, for me, my hobby was always dance. So during my PhD, I used to teach dance once a week. And the teaching part of it was great because I loved the teaching aspect, but it also was my, activity, my exercise in addition. So when I taught, I wouldn't just stand and teach. I would do it all at the same time. So I was getting my exercise in. So really finding those passions that your hobbies and making sure you keep up with them, I think is so important, because you don't want to lose yourself in the degree.
Right.
It is a part of you, which is great. And it's a big part of you, especially in grad school. And I still think that aspect was a big part of my life. But it is not your entirety, exactly.
So we're going to wind up, and I want to do maybe a little bit of a fun exercise. Sure. A couple things. Number one, I'm going to time you. And in 1 minute, I want you to pitch an MSL role to our graduate listeners.
All right.
Go.
So the medical science liaison role is really the bridge between the pharmaceutical industry and the clinicians or physicians that are treating the patients. And so being able to bring the knowledge of the clinical data, the molecule, the medicine to the physicians and help them understand why this might be good for their patients. Overall, then, what you do is from those discussions, you can bring back any insights or any thoughts that the physician has to the company so that the company can better shape the way they see or position themselves in the market.
That was fabulous. And 36 seconds.
Oh my goodness.
Way to go.
I got more time.
And last thing, this is something I'm ripping off of one of my favorite podcasts, Diary of a CEO. And at the end of every podcast, he asks the person he's interviewing to write down a question for the next person he's interviewing. So I'm going to invite you to write down a question for our next interviewee without knowing who they are.
Okay.
And while you're doing that, we'll just wrap up. And I just want to say thank you again for taking your very precious time, because I'm sure you have a very busy schedule. We've learned so much from you. And to learn more about the role, we've learned more about your trajectory and just those narratives, your experience, your trajectory through grad school, how you've leveraged so beautifully into this role, into a fulfilling role where you can see a future. It's very hopeful. And I want to thank you again for coming and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. I hope that the graduate students take something away. And definitely, I mean, there is light at the end of the tunnel for those that are struggling. I definitely struggled. And so being able to share my story and my experience hopefully inspires others that it's not just academia that is an option, but industry careers are really fulfilling as well.
Thank you, Dr. Dubinsky.
Thank you so much.